So we have the film advanced components in place. We have the rewind all in place. At the top of the camera here, the next thing I need to do is put my rangefinder back in place. And this will be not much fun, I can just tell. As soon as you disturb the position of this shaft and its related cam on the top of the mechanism, it is extremely difficult to get it back where it should be. However, that's what we've got to achieve. So here I have the rangefinder. I'll just run a tiny smear of grease down the inside of that shaft, where the shaft runs through that bush. See if I can wriggle this onto that shaft. And that's it. It's wriggled. I've got 3 screws that hold the rangefinder to the top of the camera body. I'll just run that in loosely. I'll mention about cleaning the rangefinder. There aren't many components here that need to be cleaned. Those 3 screws are in position. I'll check that it's seated. Do those screws up tight. There's an awful lot of pencil marks around the inside of this camera, whether they're from servicing or from manufacture, I can't really tell. Okay, so optical components in the rangefinder here. Well, we have a prism here, simple glass prism. 2 faces are easy to get at the front. Clean those, they can be cleaned with normal glass cleaner, not a problem. We have a semi-silvered mirror here. That semi-silvered mirror, the front surface, the surface facing the front of the camera, is plain glass. You can clean that with a cotton bud, a Q-tip, bit of glass cleaner, no problem. It's robust, no problem. The rear surface is surface silvered. That silver will come off if you breathe on it hard. Be very cautious about that. Do not touch it with a cotton bud. Do not touch it with anything. In this case, I cleaned the outside surface, the front surface, as I said, I've cleaned the prism. The inside surface, I used this ElectroClean. I gave it a spray of that. All I did was spray that across the surface and then blow it off with a blower. I didn't touch the surface. Even doing that's been pretty ambitious, I think. That silver just comes off. You just got to look at it the wrong way, it's off. You'll have a nice piece, clean piece of glass and no reflective image if you touch that inside surface. Right, that aside, let's see if we can put this back together. Just checking these components. They only go together in one direction. I've got to make sure I've got that direction clear in my head. That's it. This cam goes on there. One side's a little bit chewed off on this cam. It's undercut. It's undercut to clear the spring underneath here. So that goes to the front. On top of that we have our triangular washer, which is some sort of spring washer or lock washer. And then we have a single screw holding this together. Now effectively, that shaft coming up from the lever will be pulling into a taper. So as you do that screw up, it pulls up tight and then doesn't want to turn after that. You can see as I turn the focus at the front of the camera, you'll see this drum rotate slightly. Doesn't rotate far, it doesn't need to. I'm not doing that screw up tight. On top of that runs our other component. And I can see already that I've got that around a considerable distance because it needs to run in vaguely that orientation. This lever runs against that pin. And it looks like it's going to be somewhere about there. That lever looks slightly bent to me. It looks like it's rubbing further down than it should do. We have two screws. There's a lot of adjustments here, and you can believe me, they are extremely tedious to deal with. Now this screw, we've got two screws here, look virtually identical. Now one of them is chewed off. Now the chewed off one, and I say chewed off, it's cut away at an angle at the base. That must run through the slot where the that cam was shaved away. Not that it makes an awful difference. Get that screw started. Because the end of it's not square, it doesn't want to start. Alright, so that's going to sit somewhere like that. I have a screw here, a post, which goes through to the shaft. And I need to get that in. The spring runs on that post. It's the return spring. There are two springs here. One for the arm, the one that's coupled there to keep it biased in one position. And a much heavier spring which is coupled to this arm with the prism on it to keep that in close contact with that position. So I'll hook the heavier spring in place first. Then I'll hook the lighter spring in place over here. Just get this in an orientation that suits me. It's odd, it was easy enough to get off, but it doesn't want to go back on. How about that? Nope. That's better. Alright, Now all the levers have been kept in close contact with the parts they need to mesh with, and I can think about doing my adjustments. I need to have the top cover in place to check what's happening basically here. So I'm just going to pop the top cover loosely in place, check out the window, see if the rangefinder is even vaguely in sync with where it should be. Oh, that looks absolutely awful. Not within a bull's roar of correct there. You'll recall I didn't tighten the screw up, so I can pull that cam around on the shaft. That's miles away. Am I going the wrong way? Perhaps. I may have to tighten that screw up just so it'll stay in place. Now, which end of the range is that? It's that end of the range, and it needs to go much more around that end of the range. So, let's shift it to there. Alright, we're on the right track. Needs to come back a bit. The amount of movement that's required is quite small. You'll notice that because the adjustment range as you swing through the focus range is quite small. Okay, that's pretty good. It's not quite right. I want to see if it's good enough to tighten up that screw and then I can work with my adjustments after that. Well, that's pretty close. That is pretty much bang on. Alright, so where I've got this sitting at the moment, where this cam arrangement at the top, its position relative to the shaft coupled to the focus mechanism is just bang on at the moment. So if I can remove my springs, remove this top cam piece, I can tighten up my screw that was coupling the bottom cam to that shaft, I should be in business. That's the theory, and now I just have to achieve it. That spring can stay in place, that one can come off, just so that's swung out of the way and it's not fouling me up. These two screws can come off. As I say, with that screw under here with that lock washer is pulling up on a taper, so it will tend to lock this in position on the shaft. I want that arranged, I want that orientation to stay exactly where it is. I certainly didn't have that screw tight. Here's a bigger screwdriver. Okay. I'll pop the screws back in place. I've chewed off one here. And the complete one over here. So we have a couple of adjustments here for our horizontal adjustment. This arm with the post on it can be adjusted around its axis, around the centre, the lock screw here and an adjustment here. That will shift the point at which the images align. There's slots under these two screws. They're slotted holes, and it means that I can shift the top cam this direction and this direction relative to the post, which will change the ratio of movement when you are moving from the close focus to a distant focus scale here. So I've got to try and get the rangefinder accurate, not just at infinity, but also at the close-up focus end of the scale. And that's where the fun and games all come in. Because as soon as you move one adjustment, it shifts the other position of the other adjustment. Excuse me. No, that was no one of any importance on the phone. It was just the Indian scammers. I don't know what it's like in your part of the world, but here we get pestered by Indian tech support scammers who phone at least 3 times a week trying to tell me that my internet is corrupt, or that they're going to turn off the internet, or they're going to empty my bank account, or some other trick of that nature. I just get sick of it. Earlier today I just gave them the whistle treatment. This time I just told them all about their pedigree. Back to work. Let's see what happens. Alright, well that's certainly not adjusted correctly, but at least I know now that it is fixed fairly solidly, and I will attempt to make adjustments to bring it into line. Which way do I think I need to move it? It's moving beyond the infinity point, and the infinity point takes it to the rear, so I need to bring that arm further forward. Let's try that. This should be the lock screw. This should be my adjustment. This is an eccentric. Well, the whole of this is fairly well locked up with lacquer. I think I'm just going to have to put a drop of acetone on here to free this adjustment up. Let's see how that works. That is pretty close, pretty close. All right. Okay. I'm going to make another. The adjustments I've made so far are the horizontal adjustment, there to align the images horizontally. The images are also out vertically, which means that one image basically is sitting slightly higher than the other. And the adjustment for that is made by shifting the two screws at this point, tightening one or the other, which effectively throws this pivot across, backwards or forwards, which shifts the angle of the prism slightly, which effectively it raises or lowers the image coming through that prism relative to the fixed surface silvered mirror. And I can see that my vertical alignment is slightly off. I'm going to see if I can remedy that. We have actually, that screw's loose. Now it's interesting. I'll tighten that screw down. That screw shouldn't have been loose. We'll see what difference that's made to my vertical adjustment. My moving image is slightly low. I'll need to put a drop of acetone on here. These adjustments are well locked up. It's a fairly normal practice to lock adjustments with a touch of paint or lacquer. In this case, somebody has used a fairly broad brush. It doesn't want to move. That one does. I'll slacken that one off slightly, see if we're moving in the right direction. There's a 50-50 chance that's the correct direction, so we'll find out. I said the moving image was low, didn't I? Well, it's a bit higher now. It's not that far away. So that was probably the correct thing to do. Let me slacken that slightly, tighten that screw, and check. It's still low. Oh, I've got that screw moving now, that's good. Particularly when small screws are made of brass, they're very easily damaged. And you have to be quite cautious when you're having to apply a lot of force to them to turn them. You need to be very cautious indeed. It's still low. Things are not moving as I expect them to move. Well, now we're in business. That looks good. So the horizontal adjustment, I need to make an adjustment there now. Let me check which direction I'm moving in. I think I know. Doesn't come round far enough. Need to back off slightly on the adjustment here. course, because everything is locked up with lacquer, the levers don't move as smoothly as you might want them to. Oh, that's good. That's right on the money. Alright. I'm happy with that at infinity. I need to check what my close focus range is like. I'll be back later. Alright, well the day's nearly done here. It's getting fairly dim out there. I have that rangefinder to my satisfaction. Basically, as I said, the horizontal alignment is made by moving this post round the centre in either direction in order to get it to align the images correctly horizontally. The vertical alignment is done here, shifting the pivot of this point effectively slightly this way or that way to make the adjustments so that I had correct focus at infinity, correct alignment at infinity, and correct alignment at the close focusing end of the scale. Required moving this top cam plate complete on it's on like a dovetail, moving it slightly inwards so that I now have correct alignment of my images at 2.5 meters and correct alignment at infinity. So I'm happy with those adjustments. That all looks good to me, and I can continue with the reassembly of the top part of the camera. So I'll check what stage I'm up to. I think I'm ready to put the frame counter back on here now. I can see a fingerprint on that rangefinder prism. Let me deal with that now. That looks good. The frame counter and its post are here. So I'll lubricate the shaft for the frame counter. That goes down into a little bronze bush. And this sits on the top plate right here. The arm of the rangefinder drops back in underneath there between the number plate at the top and the gear below it. So you can't lift it directly off, you need to muck around with it. So this is held to the top cover with 2 screws. I have my top cover here. I've cleaned the rangefinder and viewfinder ports on this, so that's all nice and clean. This should just lower into position. The top cover is held in place with 2 screws. 2 long chrome plated screws. These are a little bit awkward to position correctly. Especially the one at this end of the body. It fits into a post, I suppose you could say. The post is fairly narrow, so inevitably when you're trying to lower the screw in, it drops to one side or other of that post. And so you can't screw it in. That's better. Just checking that the the frame counter revolved smoothly. Put the advance knob in place. That looks good. Put our shutter release button back in place. Film advance, so I'm just going to put my spanner on the top of the spanner I've got here, goes on top of the take-up spool. There's two flats there. Hold the shaft from turning. You must hold the shaft from turning, not just rely on the advanced lock mechanism to hold it while you're doing up things like that, otherwise you will break something for sure. Just tighten up that shutter release. Just checking that that pops up nicely. Now, film rewind end. This is fun. This is where I've got to hook that J-shaped spring back into place and get the knob in place. The J-shaped spring is held in place by that knob. It's not an easy task to achieve this, but of course it can be done. So I'm checking which side I need to be on, and I know it's this side. This knob, one side of it's got a flat on it. That's the side that goes to the spring, the J-shaped spring. You only need about 3 or 4 hands to achieve this task. It's usually helped by a lot of swearing. Of course, the whole rewind wants to try and disappear down into the body as you're trying to achieve this, making the whole process that much more entertaining. And if you're thinking that this is a little piece of crappy design, you'd be dead right. But I can assure you that the earlier model, the 122 Retina II, was crappier than this. Usually I would have to do this, attempt to do this 2 or 3 times before I ended up with the rewind working correctly. For one reason or another, the J-shaped spring would fail to hook behind the ball correctly. The rewind knob locks into position, allowing me to view through the rangefinder. If I hold back the rewind button at the end and rotate it, I can't, the ball's not dropping into place correctly. I can just tell. It's just clicking, but it's not dropping into the centre, so I haven't got the end of that J-shaped spring sitting correctly. and I'll have to have another attempt. Yeah, it's definitely the case. Right. I'm not going to show you me fighting with this for the next 20 minutes. I'll show you when it's done. Well, wonders will never cease. I got that to work correctly on the second attempt. So now we have a camera that will effectively rewind the film properly. And when the rangefinder rewind knob is in the park position, the fork is free to revolve, and so the film could be advanced through the camera. So the top of the camera has been dealt with, and I can turn my attention to the bottom of the camera. And in the bottom of the camera, our tasks here are to glue back the leather and fit the depth of field, scale and the surround for the tripod knob. So I've got my piece of leather. I've also got that small card or paper disc that I mentioned sat on top of the end of that sprocket shaft. That can just sit loosely in place. We don't want that gluing to anything there. It can glue to the leather, that's fine. So I've got my leather, I've cleaned it. I've cleaned it and removed all the loose threads of leather from the back of it with some wet and dry paper. Being very careful and moving all in one direction, just to cut loose any raised threads of leather which would otherwise cause lumps and bumps and generally make it a nuisance to try and glue down flat. So I'll spread this adhesive out evenly. That seems fine. I'm going to cheat here. Where this hole is in here, this is where the release button runs through, and I just ran through that with a toothpick that had a little bit of grease on the end of it, and that's so that I don't glue the leather to the release button. That would be a nuisance. It wouldn't stop it working probably, but it would stiffen up the action and the leather would rise and fall with the button. We could probably do without that. Now you may recall there were some pretty nasty Zeiss bumps on the bottom of the camera here. Now they have gone. The leather's stuck down nice and flat. All those corrosion products I think was there and there. Now I can tell this is another way I can tell that this camera was a German market model is that it doesn't have made in Germany embossed on the tripod surround. Tripod socket surround usually has made in Germany engraved in it if this was an export model. That's good. And our depth of field scale. So we have a wavy washer which provides a little bit of tension on it so that it doesn't just rattle about. That doesn't require much grease at all because it's not doing a hell of a lot. I'll just run a little bit of grease synthetic grease through there. Just so it's not making nasty scraping sounds. And if we align all the holes, the screws should go through. And we can screw it down. Number 1. Number 2. Because this was made for the domestic German market, of course, the focus scale is all marked in metres, not feet. Right, there's our depth of field dial. The front locks out nicely, nice and smooth, everything's looking nice and square, rangefinder's good. The camera body, I'll zoom you back out of it. The camera body is now finished with. I'll probably give the leather a little bit of attention with a bit of wax polish, but otherwise that's all looking good, and it's considerably better than it was when I started. I'll put the body to one side. My next task is to strip and service the shutter. I haven't noticed anything unusual about this yet, except that the Kodak nameplate ring with their apertures markings down the bottom here is missing one of its 2 screws. So I'll have to find a screw to replace that when I service it. But that's not a job for today, I'll deal with that tomorrow.